They tell you the isolation is the hardest part of taking a job in the deep wilderness. They tell you that the silence will play tricks on your mind, that the lack of human contact will make you start talking to yourself just to hear a voice. They lie. The hardest part isn't the isolation. The hardest part is the sudden, terrifying realization that you aren't actually alone. I took the job as a fire lookout at Watchtower 7 in the Blackwood Expanse because I needed to disappear for a while. The pay was decent, the requirements were minimal, and the location was about as remote as you could get without leaving the continent. A helicopter dropped me and 3 months' worth of supplies onto a bald, rocky peak piercing through an endless ocean of old-growth pine. The pilot, a gruff guy named Mac, helped me unload the crates, clapped me on the shoulder, and told me to keep my eyes peeled and my radio charged. Then he took off, the thumping of the rotors fading into a profound, suffocating silence. Watchtower 7 was a wooden box perched on 50 feet of reinforced steel scaffolding. The cabin itself was a 12 by 12 square of glass and timber, giving me a 360-degree view of wilderness, so vast it made my stomach drop just looking at it. The setup was basic. A cot, a propane stove, an Osborne fire finder sitting dead center in the room, and a two-way radio that was my only lifeline to the outside world. I spent my first afternoon organizing my canned goods, checking the solar battery banks, and getting a feel for the space. It was peaceful. The wind howled constantly, rattling the thick glass panes, but inside, I felt safe. I felt untouchable. It wasn't until the sun started to dip below the jagged teeth of the western mountains that I found the logbook. It was tucked underneath a loose floorboard near the foot of the cot, wrapped in a thick plastic bag to protect it from the damp. I pulled it out, expecting a ledger of weather patterns, supply lists, maybe some board doodles from the previous lookouts. The leather cover was worn smooth, and the pages were yellowed and brittle. I sat cross-legged on the cot, cracked it open, and found pages filled with frantic, cramped handwriting. The first few pages were standard. Wind speeds, humidity readings, minor complaints about the cold. But then, about 20 pages in, the daily log stopped abruptly. In their place was a list. The handwriting was different here, harder, pressed so deeply into the paper that the pen had nearly torn through. At the top of the page, underlined 3 times, were the words, "Survival Protocols for Tower 7. I chuckled to myself. Hazing the new guy. It was a classic move in these isolated jobs. Leave a creepy note. Try to spook the rookie. I leaned back against the wall and read through them, amused by the creativity of whoever had occupied this box before me. Rule number 1. The trapdoor leading up into the cabin must be bolted and deadlocked precisely 5 minutes before sunset. Do not open it until the sun has completely cleared the eastern ridge. If you hear someone climbing the metal stairs after dark, do not look out the window to see who it is. Rule number 2. Your radio is for official check-ins only, scheduled at 0800 and 1800 hours. If the radio turns itself on in the middle of the night and you hear static, ignore it. If the static begins to sound like a voice you recognize, unplug the unit from the battery bank immediately. Wait exactly 1 hour before plugging it back in. Rule number 3. When scanning the northern quadrant, you may occasionally see a thin plume of smoke rising from a valley floor. Verify the color through your binoculars. If the smoke is gray, white, or black, treat it as a potential wildfire and call it in. If the smoke is pale blue, lower the blinds on the north-facing windows. Do not log it. Do not report it. Do not look in that direction again for at least 24 hours. Rule number 4. If the heavy fog rolls in and obscures the tree line, stay away from the glass. Sit in the center of the room. Do not use your binoculars to pierce the fog. You will not like what is looking back at you. Rule number 5. If you wake up and find that the Osborne fire finder has been turned to point directly at the trapdoor, do not attempt to realign it. Lock yourself inside the supply locker under the cot and wait until you hear the heavy footsteps leave the catwalk. I closed the book, shaking my head. It was a good effort, I had to admit. It had that perfectly unhinged quality that makes for a great campfire story. I tossed the logbook onto the small wooden desk, made myself a cup of instant coffee, and watched the last slivers of daylight bleed out of the sky. As a joke, or maybe just to humor the ghost of the previous lookout, I reached down and slid the heavy iron bolt across the trapdoor just as the shadows swallowed the forest below. The first week passed in a blur of mundane routine. I woke up with the sun, drank my terrible coffee, checked the humidity and wind speed, and did my morning radio check-in with dispatch. A woman named Sarah usually answered. Her voice was crisp, professional, and entirely detached. It was the only human contact I had. I found myself looking forward to those brief, crackling conversations. The rest of the day was spent reading, scanning the horizon for any signs of fire, and watching the weather roll across the endless canopy of green. It was incredibly beautiful. I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. The rules in the logbook completely slipped my mind. On the 8th night, the weather broke. It started as a low, ominous rumble in the distance, a dark bruise of clouds gathering over the southern peaks. By midnight, a full-blown mountain storm had descended on the tower. The wind wasn't just howling anymore. It was screaming, slamming into the glass walls of the force of a freight train. The entire wooden structure groaned and swayed, making the floor tilt sickeningly beneath my feet. I sat on my cot, wrapped in a heavy wool blanket, watching the lightning-carved jagged white scars across the pitch-black sky. Every thunderclap vibrated in my chest. At 2:14 a.m., the radio clicked on. I jumped, startled by the sudden hiss of static cutting through the noise of the storm. I stared at the black rectangular box sitting on the desk. I hadn't touched it since my 6 p.m. check-in. The volume dial was turned all the way down, yet the static hissed loudly, filling the small cabin. I stood up, wrapping the blanket tighter around my shoulders, and took a step toward the desk. The static crackled, popping violently. Then, beneath the white noise, I heard it, a faint, rhythmic sound, like someone trying to catch their breath. "Dispatch," I said, my voice sounding weak and thin in the dark. "Sarah, that you? You're coming in broken. Over." The breathing stopped. The static smoothed out into a low, continuous hum. Then a voice spoke. "Elias." My blood turned to ice water. It wasn't Sarah's crisp, professional tone. It was a man's voice, deep, raspy, and achingly familiar. It was my father's voice. My father, who had been dead for 6 years. "Elias, it's so cold out here." My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I backed away from the desk, my hands trembling. Logic screamed at me. It was a cross-frequency. The storm was bouncing radio waves from a distant town. My isolated brain was taking random audio patterns and assigning them meaning, oral pareidolia. But my ears couldn't deny the specific cadence, the slight rasp at the end of the syllables. "Let me in, Elias. I can't find the stairs." Rule number 2 flashed in my mind like a neon sign. If the static begins to sound like a voice you recognize, unplug the unit from the battery bank immediately. I lunged forward, grabbed the thick black power cord connecting the radio to the solar battery pack, and yanked it hard. The plug popped out. The radio died instantly. I stood there in the dark, my chest heaving, listening to the furious roar of the wind outside. I told myself it was just a nightmare, a symptom of sleep deprivation and stress. The storm was playing tricks on me. I retreated to my cot, pulled the blanket over my head, and lay awake until the gray light of dawn finally crept through the windows. When I plugged the radio back in for my 0800 check-in, Sarah's voice came through, clear and unaffected. I asked if they had been trying to reach me during the night. She paused, checked her logs, and told me no. The frequency had been dead quiet all night. The incident rattled me, but in the bright light of day, it was easy to rationalize. The human brain is a pattern recognition machine. When starved of input, it creates its own. I was just stressed. That's what I kept repeating to myself as I wiped down the glass and checked the perimeter. But things didn't go back to normal. The atmosphere in the tower had shifted. The silence no longer felt peaceful. It felt expectant, like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for me to make a mistake. 3 days later, the fog rolled in. It didn't drift in slowly like normal mountain mist. It rose from the valley floor rapidly, an unnatural, thick white soup that swallowed the pines whole. Within an hour, the world outside my cabin disappeared. I couldn't see the ground 50 feet below. I couldn't see the catwalk surrounding the glass room. It was like floating in an endless void of milk. I paced the small cabin, feeling a sudden, intense claustrophobia. The glass walls, usually my window to the world, now felt like a display case. And I remembered rule number 4. Do not use your binoculars to pierce the fog. You will not like what is looking back at you. It was ridiculous. A fog bank was a meteorological event, not a paranormal one. I needed to check the tree line to make sure there wasn't a smoldering lightning strike hidden beneath the vapor. It was my job. I walked over to the desk, picked up the heavy brass binoculars, and wiped the lenses with the edge of my shirt. I stepped up to the south-facing window. I lifted the binoculars to my eyes and adjusted the focus wheel. At first, there was only shifting, swirling white. I panned slowly left to right, trying to find a break in the mist, a glimpse of the jagged mountain ridge that usually dominated that direction. The fog seemed to move against the wind, roiling and churning in unnatural patterns. Then, the white parted for just a fraction of a second. Standing in the fog, roughly 100 yards away and elevated at the exact same height as my tower, was a figure. It was impossibly tall, its limbs stretched and distorted like taffy. It had no face, just a pale, smooth expanse of grayish skin. But I knew it was looking at me. I could feel the weight of its attention pinning me to the floorboards. The fog shifted, swallowing the figure again. I dropped the binoculars. They hit the wooden floor with a heavy thud, the sound echoing sharply in the quiet cabin. I stumbled backward until my shoulders hit the central table, holding the fire finder. My breath caught in my throat. I squeezed my eyes shut, rubbing them furiously. Just a shadow, I whispered to myself, my voice trembling. A trick of the light, a dead tree looming in the mist. But I knew there were no trees that tall, and dead trees don't turn their heads to watch you. I spent the rest of the day sitting exactly in the center of the room, as the logbook had instructed, staring at the floor, refusing to look out the windows until the fog finally burned off late in the afternoon. When the forest revealed itself again, bathed in golden sunlight, there was nothing there, just an ocean of endless, undisturbed pine. I want to call dispatch. I wanted to tell Sarah to send Mac back with a helicopter, to tell them I was having a mental breakdown and needed an immediate evac. But what would I say? I saw a tall shadow in the fog. I heard my dead dad on a broken radio. They would put me in a psych ward, and I wouldn't see a dime of the contract money. I needed this job. I had to pull myself together. I decided the logbook was a psychological trap. Whoever wrote it knew the exact kind of auditory and visual hallucinations isolation caused, and they had written a guide to make the next guy paranoid. If you read that seeing blue smoke means danger, your brain will eventually invent blue smoke to justify the fear. It was a self-fulfilling prophecy. The only way to beat it was to completely ignore the rules. That night, I didn't bolt the trapdoor. I left it unlatched. A silent act of rebellion against the encroaching madness. I cooked a can of beans, read a few chapters of a paperback novel, and went to sleep feeling a strange sense of victory. I was taking back control. I woke up to the sound of metal scraping against metal. My eyes snapped open. The cabin was pitch black. The moon was hidden behind a thick bank of clouds. I lay perfectly still on my cot, holding my breath, straining my ears. Clang, scrape. It was coming from outside, from the steel scaffolding below the tower. Clang, clang. It was the sound of heavy boots hitting the metal grating of the spiral staircase. Someone was climbing the tower. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked through my veins. We were 50 miles from the nearest logging road. There were no hikers in this sector, no maintenance crews scheduled, and nobody climbs a fire tower at 3 in the morning. Clang, clang, clang. The footsteps were slow, deliberate. They weren't rushed. They were ascending with a heavy, dragging rhythm. I slowly pushed the wool blanket off my chest and swung my legs over the side of the cot. My bare feet hit the freezing wooden floor. I didn't make a sound. I crept toward the center of the room, my eyes locked on the rectangular outline of the trapdoor set into the floorboards. The unbolted trapdoor. Clang, clang. They were getting closer. They were past the halfway point. I lunged to the trapdoor, Dropping to my knees, I grabbed the heavy iron bolt and slammed it home just as the footsteps reached the landing right beneath the cabin floor. The noise stopped. I stayed on my knees, my face inches from the wood, my hands pressing flat against the floorboards as if my weight alone could keep whatever was down there from coming through. The silence was deafening. I could hear my own blood roaring in my ears. Then a knock. Tap, tap, tap. Knuckles against the underside of the trapdoor. Gentle, polite. I scrambled backward, crab walking until my back hit the base of the desk. I pulled my knees to my chest, my eyes wide, staring at the wooden square in the floor. "Hey in there," a voice called out. It was muffled through the thick timber, but it was clear enough to understand. It was Mac, the helicopter pilot. "Elias, buddy, you awake?" "It's Mac. Got caught in some terrible downdrafts. Had to put the bird down in a clearing a few miles north. Left the radio in the cockpit. I hiked through the dark. Man, it's freezing out here. Be a pal and open up. Let me get some coffee." Relief washed over me so intensely, I almost laughed. It was Mac. Of course. A mechanical issue, a forced landing, a completely rational human explanation. I started to push myself up from the floor, ready to slide the bolt back and welcome him in. But my hand froze on the metal desk leg. Something was wrong. Mac had dropped me off 3 weeks ago. He operated out of an airfield 200 miles away. Why would he be flying over Watchtower 7 in the middle of the night? Furthermore, a helicopter going down, even a controlled emergency landing, makes noise. It causes a massive disturbance. I hadn't heard any rotors. I hadn't heard a crash. And I noticed the phrasing. Be a pal and open up. The voice was perfect. The gravelly tone, the slight southern drawl. But the cadence was too smooth. It lacked the breathlessness of a man who had just hiked miles through dense wilderness in the dark and then climbed 50 feet of steep metal stairs. "Come on, Elias," the voice said from beneath the floorboards. The polite tapping turned into a heavier thumping. "It's cold. My hands are numb. Just open the door." I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I stared at the heavy iron bolt I had slid into place just moments before. Rule number 1. If you hear someone climbing the metal stairs after dark, do not look out the window to see who it is. "I know you're awake, Elias," the voice said. The southern drawl slipped. The gravelly tone flattened out into something monotonic, something mechanical. "I can hear your heart beating." The thumping against the trapdoor escalated. It wasn't knuckles anymore. It sounded like heavy wooden mallets slamming against the underside of the floor. Bam, bam, bam. The whole cabin shook. Dust fell from the ceiling joints. The glass panes rattled violently in their frames. "Open the door! Open the door! Open the door!" The voice was booming now, echoing from beneath me, but it was no longer just Mac's voice. It was a chorus. Mac, my father, Sarah from dispatch, blending together in a horrific, overlapping shriek. I clamped my hands over my ears and squeezed my eyes shut, curling into a tight ball against the desk. The pounding was relentless, vibrating to the floorboards, threatening to shatter the wood. I prayed the heavy iron bolt would hold. I prayed the hinges wouldn't give way. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the pounding stopped. The chorus of voices cut off. The sudden silence was a physical blow. I stayed curled in a ball for what felt like hours, too terrified to move a muscle. I waited for the heavy metallic clang of footsteps descending the stairs, but it never came. Whoever or whatever was out there hadn't left. It was just waiting. Slowly, agonizingly, I uncurled my body. My limbs were stiff and cramped. The cabin was still dark, but the clouds had parted slightly, allowing a faint sliver of moonlight to filter through the windows. I pulled myself up using the desk, my legs trembling so badly they could barely support my weight. I looked down at the trapdoor. The wood around the lock was splintered, but the bolt had held. I needed to call dispatch. I needed to break protocol and scream into the radio until someone sent an armed rescue team. I reached for the radio unit on the desk, my fingers fumbling in the dark. As I turned, my eyes swept past the north-facing windows. I froze. Down in the valley, miles away in the dense, unbroken expanse of the northern quadrant, a thin, steady plume of smoke was rising into the night sky. It was glowing, a luminous, sickeningly pale blue. Rule number 3. If the smoke is pale blue, lower the blinds on the north-facing windows. Do not log it. Do not report it. Do not look in that direction again. I stared at it. It was mesmerizing. It didn't billow or disperse like normal smoke. It snaked upward in a perfectly straight line, cutting through the darkness like a laser beam. And as I watched, a terrible realization washed over me. The wind was blowing hard from the east. The trees below the tower were bending under the force of the gale, but the pale blue smoke wasn't moving. It defied the wind entirely, rising perfectly vertical. I moved to the window, unable to tear my eyes away. The fear that had paralyzed me moments before was suddenly replaced by a heavy, narcotic compulsion. I needed to see exactly where it was coming from. I pressed my hands against the cold glass, leaning closer. The moment my forehead touched the pane, a massive shadow slammed into the glass right in front of my face. I screamed, stumbling backward, tripping over the cot and crashing onto the floor. Pressed against the outside of the window, hanging effortlessly 50 feet in the air, was the figure I had seen in the fog. It was impossibly thin, its skin the color of dirty snow. It had long, multi-jointed fingers tipped with jagged black nails that were currently screeching against the glass. But what horrified me most was its face. It didn't have eyes or a nose, just a smooth expanse of flesh with a single massive vertical slit running from where its forehead should be down to its chin. The slit parted. Inside was a blinding, unnatural light, the exact same color as the pale blue smoke rising in the distance. The glass began to crack under its weight. Small, spiderweb fractures spread out from its horrific hands. The cold mountain air seeped into the cabin through the fissures. It was trying to get in. I scrambled to my feet, my mind entirely shattered, acting on pure, desperate adrenaline. The radio was useless. The trapdoor was compromised. The glass was breaking. There was only one place to go. I dove under the cot, grabbing the handle of the heavy metal supply locker bolted to the floor. I yanked it open, throwing out cans of soup, extra boots, and medical supplies, frantically clearing a space. Crack! A large chunk of the north window shattered inward, scattering glass across the floorboards. The temperature in the room plummeted instantly. A foul metallic stench flooded the cabin, like ozone and rotting meat. I squeezed myself into the tiny metal locker, pulling my knees tight to my chest. I grabbed the heavy lid and pulled it down over me, plunging myself into absolute, suffocating darkness just as I heard a heavy, wet thump land on the wooden floor of the cabin above me. I held the handle on the inside of the lid with both hands, pulling it tight. My lungs burned. I squeezed my eyes shut in the dark. Above me, heavy, dragging footsteps began to pace the floorboards. Thump, drag, thump, drag. It walked around the central table. It walked over to the desk. I heard the sickening sound of metal tearing as it casually ripped the radio unit apart. Then, the footsteps moved toward the cot. It stood directly above the supply locker. I could hear it breathing. A wet, rattling sound. The metallic stench seeped through the cracks in the locker. Then it spoke. Not in Mac's voice. Not in my father's voice. It spoke in a sound that was like grinding stones, a sound that vibrated directly into my teeth. I can see you hiding, Elias. The blue light sees everything. Suddenly, the heavy metal lid of the locker was violently wrenched upward. I screamed, pulling with all my strength, my muscles tearing, my knuckles white, fighting to keep the lid closed. But the strength of the thing pulling from the outside was astronomical. The metal groaned. The handle dug into my palms. The lid began to inch open. A crack of pale blue light sliced into the darkness of the locker, falling across my terrified face. I squeezed my eyes shut. I kicked upward with both feet, slamming my boots against the inside of the lid, fighting for my life against an impossible force. I knew that if it opened that lid, I would never leave the Blackwood Expanse. I would become just another voice in static. The lid lifted another inch. The smell of rotting meat was overpowering. Cold, jagged fingers slipped on the metal rim, inches from my hands. I prepared to die. And then, the blaring sound the emergency klaxon mounted on the roof of the tower suddenly triggered, an ear-splitting mechanical wail that shook the entire structure. The sound was a physical force, a blaring, rhythmic shockwave that rattled my teeth in my skull and vibrated to the metal locker like a continuous earthquake. It was the emergency evacuation siren, a massive industrial horn mounted on the apex of the roof, designed to warn logging camps miles away of an uncontrolled blaze. The creature directly above me let out a noise that I will never, as long as I live, be able to fully describe. It wasn't a scream. It was a violent, screeching distortion, like radio feedback amplified through a jet engine. The pressure on the locker lid instantly vanished. The heavy, jagged fingers snapped back. The lid slammed shut with a deafening metallic clang, plunging me back into absolute darkness. I heard the frantic, heavy thud of the entity scrambling backward across the wooden floorboards. The shattered glass crunched under its weight. Then came the sickening scrape of its limbs dragging against a window frame, followed by a rush of freezing air as it threw itself back out into the void of the night. The klaxon wailed for another full minute, drowning out the storm, drowning out my own ragged breathing, before abruptly cut off with a dying mechanical groan. Silence rushed back into the cabin, save for the howling wind whipping through the shattered north window. I didn't move. I lay in the pitch black of the supply locker, my knees bruised from pressing against the metal, my hands bleeding from gripping the handle. I lay there for hours. The temperature in the cabin plummeted, the mountain cold seeping through the thin metal of my hiding place, chilling my sweat-soaked clothes to my skin. I shivered so violently I thought my bones would snap, but I refused to open that lid. I waited until I was absolutely certain that the gray light of dawn was bleeding through the cracks. When I finally pushed the heavy lid upward, my muscles screamed in protest. I emerged slowly, my breath misting in the freezing air, my eyes scanning the wreckage of Watchtower 7. The place looked like a bomb had gone off. The desk was overturned. The radio was a scatter of cracked plastic and torn wires across the floorboards. The north-facing window was entirely gone, the thick glass shattered outward, leaving a jagged, gaping hole that framed the bleak, gray morning sky. Pine needles and snow had blown in, dusting the floor in a fine white powder. And then I saw the Osborne firefinder. The heavy brass instrument, mounted on its central table, had been violently rotated. It was no longer pointing toward the northern ridge. The sighting apparatus was aimed dead center at the trapdoor on the floor. Rule number 5. If you wake up and find that the Osborne firefinder has been turned to point directly at the trapdoor, do not attempt to realign it. Lock yourself inside the supply locker under the cot and wait until you hear the heavy footsteps leave the catwalk. I had unknowingly followed the rule, driven by pure instinct to hide from the window. But looking at the brass instrument now, a terrifying thought struck me. The firefinder wasn't just a map. It was a line of sight. Whatever had been in the cabin hadn't just been hunting me. It had been aiming the instrument. It was showing me where the threat was going to come from next. They weren't going to come from the glass anymore. They were coming from below. I stumbled toward the shattered window, avoiding the glass shards, and looked down. The fog had lifted, revealing the dizzying 50-foot drop to the forest floor. The metal scaffolding of the tower looked intact, but the spiral staircase winding down to the dirt was cast in deep shadows. I was completely cut off. The radio was destroyed. The temperature was dropping. The structural integrity of my only shelter was compromised, and I had no way to seal the massive hole in the wall. If I stayed in the tower for another night, I would freeze to death, assuming whatever lived in the blue smoke didn't come back to finish the job. I had to leave. The nearest logging road was a grueling 40-mile hike south through dense, uncharted wilderness. I had a topographical map, a compass, and enough adrenaline pumping through my system to outrun a bear, but I knew the statistics. Hiking through the Blackwood Expanse alone, off-trail, was practically a death sentence even under normal circumstances. But these weren't normal circumstances. I wasn't just battling the elements. I was battling an ecosystem that was actively trying to consume me. I moved with frantic, mechanical purpose. I grabbed a heavy canvas rucksack and began stuffing it with whatever survival gear I could find. Cans of soup, a thermal sleeping bag, waterproof matches, a medical kit, a heavy steel flashlight, and a flare gun with 3 red magnesium shells. I layered up, pulling on thermals, a heavy wool sweater, and a thick insulated parka. I laced my boots so tight my fingers ached. Before I left, I walked over to the desk and picked up the logbook. I flipped to the back, past the rules, past the frantic scribbles. I needed to know if there was anything else, any final piece of advice for someone stupid enough to leave the box. On the very last page, written in a shaky, almost illegible scrawl, was a single sentence. The voices only mimic what they have already eaten. I slammed the book shut, my stomach twisting into a cold knot. I shoved it into my pack. I walked over to the trapdoor. My hands shook as I gripped the heavy iron bolt. I took a deep breath, pulled the metal cylinder back, and threw the door open. The metal stairs spiraled downward into the gloom of the forest floor. I climbed down slowly, my boots clanging against the steel grating. Every sound seemed magnified 100 times in the unnatural stillness of the woods. When my boots finally hit the soft, damp earth of the forest floor, I felt incredibly small. The canopy of ancient pines towered over me, blocking out most of the sunlight, casting the world in a perpetual, sickly twilight. I pulled out my compass, took a bearing due south, and started walking. The first few hours were a grueling physical test. The undergrowth was thick, full of thorny brambles and fallen, rotting logs that I had climbed over. The air was heavy and stagnant, smelling of damp earth and decaying pine needles. But it was the silence that was the most oppressive. There were no birds, no squirrels darting up bark, no wind rustling the leaves. It was the silence of a graveyard. By mid-afternoon, my muscles were burning, and my lungs were aching from the cold air. I stopped by a small, trickling stream to refill my canteen and catch my breath. I sat on a mossy rock, chewing on a piece of dried jerky, trying to keep my mind focused on the compass needle, and not on the creeping paranoia that I was being watched. That's when I saw the orange fabric. It was a flash of unnatural color tangled in the roots of an enormous, dead pine tree about 50 yards off my current heading. It looked like a piece of a heavy-duty tarp or jacket. Curiosity, foolish and overpowering, drew me toward it. As I pushed through the ferns, the shape became clearer. It wasn't just fabric. It was metal, rusted, twisted metal, half buried in the earth and covered in a thick layer of green moss. I froze, the jerky turned into ash in my mouth. It was the tail rotor of a helicopter. I approached it slowly, every instinct screaming at me to turn around and run. I rounded the massive trunk of the dead pine and found the rest of the fuselage. It had crashed nose first into the soft earth, the cockpit completely crushed. The metal was heavily oxidized, indicating it had been sitting in this exact spot for a very, very long time. Years, at least. I crept closer to the shattered windshield. The glass was opaque with grime and algae. I wiped a small circle away with my gloved hand and peered inside. Strapped into the pilot's seat, wearing a faded orange flight jacket, was a skeleton. The skull lolled forward against the rusted flight yoke. Pinned to the chest of the jacket was a tarnished metal name badge. Mac. A cold, paralyzing dread washed over me. I stumbled backward, tripping over an exposed root and falling hard onto my back. I scrambled away from the wreckage, my heart hammering against my ribs. The voices only mimic what they have already eaten. Mac hadn't dropped me off 3 weeks ago. Mac had been dead in this forest for years. My mind spun, struggling to process the impossible reality. If Mac had been dead this whole time, who, or what, had flown the helicopter that dropped me at Watchtower 7? What had I been talking to? What had clapped me on the shoulder and told me to keep my radio charged? The forest was a trap. The tower wasn't an observation post to watch for fires. It was a feeding station. They put a human in a box, isolated them, and waited for the psychological breakdown to make them vulnerable. The rules weren't a guide to survival. They were a cruel game, a way to season the meat with terror before the harvest. I didn't stop to rest again. I picked myself up, checked my compass with trembling hands, and broke into a heavy, panicked jog. I didn't care about the noise I was making. I didn't care about snapping twigs or tearing my clothes on the underbrush. I just needed to get out. The sun began to set rapidly. the shadows stretching long and distorted across the forest floor. Panic tightened my chest as the light faded. I was still at least 20 miles from the logging road. I wasn't going to make it before dark. As twilight bled into a deep, pitch black, the temperature plummeted again. I had to stop. Running in the dark through this terrain was a guaranteed broken ankle, and a broken ankle out here was a death sentence. I found a small hollow beneath an overhang of rocks. I gathered dead, dry branches, my hands shaking violently, and used my waterproof matches to start a small fire. The flames cast dancing, erratic shadows on a rock wall. I huddled as close to the heat as I could, pulling the thermal sleeping bag over my shoulders, clutching the flare gun in my right hand. I stared into the darkness beyond the ring of firelight. I strained my ears, listening for the crunch of boots, the scrape of jagged nails, or the horrific mechanical mimicry of a human voice. For a long time there was nothing, just the crackle of the burning wood. Then the fog arrived. It didn't roll in. It seeped up from the ground, thick and unnaturally cold, suffocating the flames of my campfire until they were nothing but glowing orange embers. The white mist swallowed the trees, reducing my visibility to less than 10 feet. I stood up, my back pressed hard against the cold stone of the rock overhang. I raised the flare gun, my thumb hovering over the heavy hammer. Elias! The voice came from my left. It was my father's voice, laced with static, just like on the radio. Don't hide, Elias. It hurts more when you hide. I swung the flare gun toward the sound. The fog swirled, thick and impenetrable. Ranger Elias, please respond. A second voice crackled from my right. It was Sarah from dispatch. Chris, professional, dead. We have a visual on your location. Please step into the blue light. A soft, pale blue glow began to permeate the fog directly in front of me. It wasn't a beam. It was a diffuse, sickening luminescence that made the mist look like glowing deep-sea water. Rule number 3. If the smoke is pale blue, do not look in that direction. I couldn't look away. The glow intensified, pulsing rhythmically, matching the frantic beating of my heart. From within the blue light, a silhouette emerged. It was tall, towering over the fog line. Its limbs were unnaturally thin, jointed in places where there should be bone. As it stepped closer, the blue light illuminated its horrific, featureless face. The single vertical slit down its center was peeled wide open, radiating that blinding, hypnotic light. And then it wasn't just one. To the left, another silhouette appeared. To the right, a third. They were stepping out of the fog, surrounding the rock overhang, their slit faces glowing, illuminating the misty forest in surreal, nightmarish neon. A chorus of voices erupted from them. It was a cacophony of stolen lives. My father, Sarah, Mac, and dozens of others I didn't recognize. Screams, pleas for help, casual conversations, radio static, all overlapping in a deafening, psychotic symphony. They were closing in. Their jagged, multi-jointed fingers twitched with anticipation. The smell of ozone and rotting meat was so strong I gagged. They were 10 feet away. 5 feet. I raised a flare gun, aimed it directly at the blinding blue slit of the creature in the center, and pulled the trigger. The recoil bruised my palm. The magnesium shell exploded from the barrel with a deafening crack, streaking through the fog like a miniature sun. It struck the creature dead center in its glowing facial slit. The entity let out a shriek that shattered the air, a sound so high-pitched and violent it brought me to my knees. The flare embedded itself in the creature's flesh, burning with intense, blinding white heat, sizzling and popping as it melted through the unnatural skin. The creature thrashed wildly, its long limbs flailing, knocking over the entities beside it. The blue light from its face flickered and died, replaced by the chaotic, strobing brilliance of the burning flare. The circle was broken. The fog was illuminated by the intense white light. I didn't hesitate. I dropped my rucksack, abandoned the sleeping bag, and sprinted to the gap in their formation. I ran completely blind into the dense forest, my arms up to shield my face from the whipping branches. The shrieks of the creatures echoed behind me, mixing with the mechanical voices mimicking human screams. I ran until my lungs felt like they were filled with broken glass. I tripped over roots, rolled down steep embankments, tore my clothes and my skin on jagged rocks, and scrambled back to my feet without breaking stride. The darkness was absolute, the fog clinging to the trees like a suffocating shroud. I navigated purely by gravity, knowing that water flows downhill, and logging roads were usually built near riverbeds. I heard them behind me, the heavy, dragging thuds of their footsteps, the snapping of massive tree branches as they pushed through the forest in pursuit. They weren't fast, but they were relentless. Clang, scrape, thump. The sounds were getting closer. The smell of ozone was creeping up the back of my neck. I pushed my body past its physical limits. I bounded over a massive fallen log. My foot caught on a hidden root, and I went sprawling face first into the dirt. I slid down a steep, muddy incline, plunging into a freezing, shallow stream. I scrambled up, coughing up muddy water, my body battered and bleeding. I looked back up the embankment. At the crest of the hill, looking down at me through the trees, was a soft, pale blue glow. I turned and splashed wildly down the center of the creek. The water was agonizingly cold, numbing my legs, but it was a clear path through the dense underbrush. I followed the winding watercourse, the blue light reflecting faintly on the ripples behind me. And then I heard a sound that didn't belong to the forest. It was a low, mechanical rumble, the grinding of heavy gears, the hiss of air brakes. I rounded a bend in the creek, pushed through a thick cluster of willow branches, and stumbled onto a wide expanse of crushed gravel, a logging road. About 200 yards down the road, the massive headlights of a commercial timber transport truck pierced the darkness, illuminating the swirling fog. The truck was idling, its massive diesel engine rumbling like a sleeping beast. I dragged myself out of the creek, my boots slipping on the loose gravel, and began to run toward the lights. I waved my arms frantically, screaming at the top of my lungs. Help! Hey! Stop! Help me! The driver's side door swung open. A large man in a high-visibility vest stepped out onto the running board, peering into the darkness. Who's out there? He yelled over the sound of the engine. Please. I gasped, closing the distance. I need help. You have to get me out of here. I reached the cab, collapsing against a massive front tire, my chest heaving, covered in mud and blood. The trucker climbed down, a heavy metal flashlight in his hand. He looked at me with a mix of shock and profound suspicion. What the hell happened to you, buddy? He asked, shining the light over my battered form. Where did you come from? You're 50 miles from the nearest town. The tower. I choked out, pointing a shaking finger back toward the tree line. Watchtower 7. They're in the woods. You have to let me in. We have to drive. The trucker looked past me, shining his flashlight into the dense, dark tree line. Ain't no fire towers out this way, son, he said slowly, his grip tightening on the flashlight. Department of Forestry tore all those down in the 90s, said the structural maintenance wasn't worth the cost. My blood ran cold. No, I whispered. I was just there. I was stationed there. The helicopter dropped me off. The trucker shook his head, looking at me with pity. You must have it your head pretty hard. Come on, get in the cab. I'll radio the state troopers, get you an ambulance waiting at the way station. He helped me climb up into the massive cab of the truck. The interior was wonderfully warm, smelling of stale coffee and diesel fumes. I slumped into the passenger seat, my entire body shaking with the aftershocks of adrenaline. The trucker climbed into the driver's seat, slammed the door shut, and reached for the CB radio mounted on the dashboard. I looked out the passenger side window, staring into the impenetrable darkness of the Blackwood Expanse. Just beyond a tree line, barely visible through thick fog, a thin plume of pale blue smoke began to snake its way up into the night sky. I squeezed my eyes shut and turned away from the glass. The trucker keyed the microphone on his CB radio. Dispatch! This is Hauler 4. Got an emergency on Route 9. Found a stray hiker. Looks like he's in rough shape. Over. The radio hissed with static. It popped, cracked, and settled into a low, continuous hum. I froze. I stared at the black rectangular box on the dashboard. The static smoothed out. Copy that. Hauler 4. A crisp, professional woman's voice replied from the speaker. It was Sarah. Please hold your current position. We are sending an escort to your location. Do not look in the mirrors. Do not leave the cab." The trucker frowned, reaching for the dial. "Hold position? Listen, lady, this guy needs a hospital. I ain't waiting around out here in the dark." I lunged across the cab, my bloody hands grabbing the power cord connected to the back of the CB unit, and ripped it from the dashboard. The radio died instantly. The trucker shoved me back into the passenger seat, his face flushed with anger. "What the hell is wrong with you, kid? I'm trying to get you help." I stared at him, my eyes wide, my breathing ragged. I looked at the rearview mirror mounted outside his window. Through the glass, I could see the road stretching out behind the truck. Emerging from the fog, stepping out onto the crushed gravel of the logging road behind us, were tall, impossible silhouettes. Their slit faces were glowing, casting long, pale blue shadows across the dirt. They were surrounding the truck. I looked at the trucker, my voice dropping to a desperate, trembling whisper. "Rule number 1, I said, put the truck in gear, drive, and whatever you do, do not look out the window." If you survive this journey into Blackwood Expanse, make sure to subscribe to Late Night Stories for more horrifying tales from the deep woods. Turn off the lights, lock the doors, and whatever you do, don't look out the window. Good night.